Tonight, I'm wanting to go a bit differently. The making of the King James Version. Let me preface what I'm about to present by saying that I was raised on the King James Version. When I did my memory work, that's what I memorized from. When I think in the terms of Scripture, that's how I think, that's what I quote naturally because that's what I was reared on. And I love the King James. In fact, the reason why I use this Bible to teach from is because it's got all my study notes in it. And it would take a long time for me to transfer all those study notes to another Bible. So I naturally bring this one until it gets completely worn out. But at any rate, I think it's interesting for us to look at the history of how this version came to be. The death of Queen Elizabeth I, as you see her depicted on the screen, marked the end of a glorious era in many respects of British history. England's rise to international power, which dates from the second half of the 16th century, is widely attributed to the national stability that developed under the long reign of this queen, Elizabeth I. The defeat of the Spanish Armada marked the beginning of what would be considered a golden age, bolstered by economic growth, military success, and an emergence of English literature, such writers as Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe, Edmund Spenser, William Shakespeare, and Sir Philip Sidney, to name a few. Yet Benson Bobrick states, toward the end of Elizabeth's reign, agitation for a new translation of the Bible had increased behind the scenes. Specifically, English Parliament secretly drafted an act for the reducing of diversities of Bible now extant in the English tongue to one settled version. This act further stipulated the version was to be done by scholars from both Oxford and Cambridge, subsidized by the Church of England. Elizabeth herself agreed to the act. In 1597, discussed it with the Bishop of London, who enthusiastically backed it. Now, ironically, the peace that prevailed in England under Elizabeth did not extend similarly to the religious groups of the day. Alistair McGrath pointed out, although herself wishing religious peace, Elizabeth rapidly found herself caught up in the religious controversies of the age. She worked to achieve compromise between Protestants and Catholics, but ended up doing little more than papering over doctrinal differences, which satisfied no one, including Protestants. As a result, by the end of Elizabeth's long reign, the most serious religious tensions within England had no longer anything to do with that between Protestants and Catholics. The new battles concerned two different styles of English Protestantism, Anglicanism and Puritanism. Of particular importance to Anglicans was the close link between the church and the monarch, as well as the significance of the standard prayer book in enforcing religious conformity. The Church of England was the state church, and the Archbishop of Canterbury intended to enforce that conformity. On the other hand, the Puritans wished to radically reform the English church. McGrath stresses that Puritanism was a diverse movement during this time. However, he says by the 1580s, Geneva became for Elizabethan Puritans what Moscow was to British communists during the 1930s, a symbol of their aspirations and a source of the ideas and support that might bring them about. The Geneva Bible, about which more we'll say in a moment, thus came to be a potent symbol of the reform that they believed lay ahead. Well, Elizabeth I passed away in 1603, and then King James I of Scotland ascended to the throne. And that seemed at first to the Puritans to give them the opportunity that they had wanted. Concerning the matter of a new translation, King James had himself been turning the same matter over in his mind. In 1601, King James had suggested a revision of the Geneva Bible. He himself had been raised Presbyterian and had on several occasions affirmed publicly his support of Presbyterian forms and practice. But Bobrick says that Anglican doctrine was more congenial to his royal heart. He disliked Presbyterianism because of his own experience growing up in it. Coupled with this was his deep hatred of the Geneva Bible, focusing on the marginal notes of that Bible. Those marginal notes challenged his deep-seated belief in the divine right of kings. Thus, as a result, James now had a personal agenda to rid England of what he regarded as the baleful influence of the Geneva Bible and its detestable marginal notes. It was, in his view, the worst of all the English translations. So then, the stage was set for the making of a new version. But as the Puritans would discover, their motives were far different from those of King James. So when you look at the situation, when you detach it from the political and the religious currents of the era, it's clear that a new version of the Bible was needed in England. Wegner affirms that Elizabeth's reign, during her reign, Bible translation was freely tolerated, giving rise to several new translations. The Bishop's Bible in 1568, the Geneva Bible in 1560, and the Douay-Rheims Bible in 1609 to 1610. Yet, each of those translations reflected the religious bias of each group that produced them. For example, the Geneva Bible. It was a good translation, but it was the marginal notes that diminished it. Calvinism was taught throughout the notes. The Geneva Bible was well received by Protestants, but it was destined to never be universally accepted. As for the Douay-Rheims Bible, it was an adequate translation for Catholics, but it never matched the quality of Protestant translations. Coupled with Roman Catholic doctrine emphasized throughout, it would not become very popular. The Bishop's Bible was itself a revision of the Great Bible, and it would become the official translation of the Anglican Church under Queen Elizabeth. Better than the Great Bible, it was nevertheless inferior to the Geneva Bible, both in translation and in readability. Clearly, the Anglican bishops wanted to have a compromise, a dignified and a safe version for public reading. Because of great strides in scholarship and excellence under Queen Elizabeth, as well as in biblical scholarship in England itself, the time was right for a new translation, one that would unite all the religious groups and would ease the significant tensions that then existed. James was an unlikely figure for this, but he would serve as the catalyst of the production of just such a version. What about the translators of the King James Version? Well, first, we have Dr. John Reynolds. He spelled his name R-A-I-N-O-L-D-S. We would spell it as you would the word Reynolds. He presented the motion for the new translation at what was called the Hampton Court Conference. He was the president of Corpus Christi College in Oxford and a moderate Puritan leader. Payne declared him to be among the foremost scholars in Elizabethan and early Stuart England. He was well versed in Greek and Latin and was an obvious choice to participate in the translation. Payne adds, in spirit he was an Elizabethan artist in words who aided not only in finding happy phrases and rhythms, but in fixing what was good in the Geneva version and others before it. Then you have Richard Bancroft. Richard Bancroft was the Bishop of London, and according to McGrath, was one of the most relentless opponents of Puritanism in England. Indeed, Nicholson says that Bancroft had become a severe, ruthless sleuth after Puritan error. At the Hampton Court Conference, Bancroft opposed virtually everything that John Reynolds wanted. In line with Bancroft's opposition to Puritanism and his secret desire to ascend to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury. So he had sort of his own motivations to doing it. True to form, when Reynolds proposed a new translation, Bancroft strenuously objected. He said, "Surely not. If every man's humor were followed, there would be no end of translating," end quote. Yet, once the conference had ended, Bancroft had become a huge supporter of the new translation. McGrath lists 4 reasons for his change. First, the Hampton Court Conference had given him more than he expected. Second, he would personally select the translators, so he would supervise the process. Third, he would review the final text and be in a position to make changes. And finally, he would win favor from the king, and that would make his ascension to the position of Archbishop of Canterbury that much more easy. Then you have Lawrence Chatterton. He was now the master at this point of Emmanuel College in Cambridge and one of the most loved of all men in that university. He was a fellow classmate of Bancroft at Cambridge, and the two had been best friends. In fact, Chatterton had at one point saved Bancroft's life from an unruly mob, but now they stood on opposite sides theologically. Nicholson says that Bancroft and Chatterton remained friends. Both were from Lancashire, where wrestling is a traditional sport. And the two men, Master of Emmanuel and Bishop of London, liked to wrestle when they met. Wrestle with ideas, in other words. Then you have George Abbot. George Abbot at this point was Dean of Winchester and was the only one of the translators who ever killed a man. Yes, he killed a man. It was accidental. And he was cleared by the king himself of any wrongdoing, but not all could clear him in their hearts. At this point in his life, Abbot was a man on the rise. He would later become Archbishop of Canterbury at the death of Bancroft. Nicholson describes Abbot as a morose, intemperate man whose portraits exude a sullen rage. Abbot once had 140 Oxford undergraduates arrested. The reason? They did not take their hats off when he entered into St. Mary's Church. Because that is a great reason for arresting someone, right? He authored a book of Jonah. You know the book of Jonah? He authored a book on it that was over 600 pages long. Can you imagine a 600-page book on Jonah? He also penned a brief description of the whole world in which he denied creationism. That is, he denied that the Lord had made the world and the universe in 6 literal days. He denied it. And he was on the committee of translating. Lancelot Andrewes was a dean of Westminster. He was probably the most eminent scholar because he had mastered 15 languages, including Latin, Greek, Hebrew, Syriac, and Chaldee. He preached Queen Elizabeth's funeral and played a prominent part in King James's coronation. And he had a huge role in making the new translation. His linguistic skill and vast learning equipped him for the task of deciding between proposed translations and on what manner of expression was best. It was his pen that created many of the most memorable passages in the King James, such as the creation and the fall, Abraham and Isaac, the Exodus, David's laments for Saul, Jonathan, and Absalom from his pen, and Elijah's encounter with the still small voice. That phrase, still small voice, came from him because of his gift for eloquence. In all, there were 54 men who were chosen to serve on 6 panels or committees of translators. 2 met in Oxford, 2 in Cambridge, and 2 in Westminster. Though a few of them were touched by scandal, for the most part, these men were serious about their work, and they dedicated themselves to it. So, Bancroft drew up a list of 15 strict rules of translation. Now, you can't see them where you're sitting, obviously. It's too small of lettering. But these are 13 of the 15 rules that were approved by King James to minimize the risk of producing a Bible that might give added credibility to Puritanism, Presbyterianism, or Catholicism. Rule number 1 says, quote, "The ordinary Bible read in the church, commonly called the bishop's Bible, to be followed, and as little altered of the truth of the original will permit." Nicholson summarizes the attitude of the translators toward the bishop's Bible. It was acknowledged by everyone to not be as good as the Geneva Bible. It was too elevated for its own good, cloth-eared, and inaccessible. Pompous, obscure, and often laughable, it was never loved. Consequently, Nicholson adds, the task was too serious for Rule 1 to be taken at face value. The translators absorbed, copied, and adapted from any source they wanted. Rule 14 says as much. And the bishop's Bible is thought to have contributed no more than 8% of its phraseology to the King James Version. They were not going to be hobbled by the rather hurried production of the Elizabethan bishops. Another writer posits this claim. Tyndale, that's William Tyndale, had given his life for the English Bible. Now, let me stop here and add that William Tyndale's life is fascinating in and of itself. I would urge you to read as much as you can on the life of William Tyndale. He literally gave his life so that an English translation of the Bible could be produced. There is one brother in Christ who has since passed away from Great Britain who suggests, and I think has some merit to it, that William Tyndale quite possibly was a New Testament Christian. I think there's a lot to be said for that. At any rate, he had done no more than supply the idea and make the effort at translation. He must still be accounted a pioneer of the printed Scripture. But he, Tyndale, did more. By the royal directive which said that the new Bible should be based on the bishop's Bible, King James perpetuated the work of that so-called dangerous innovator who first planned the Bible in English print. For the bishop's Bible traced its descent through the Matthew and the Coverdale versions straight back to William Tyndale. Only a Tyndale with some alterations, a royal dedication, and the episcopal blessing. So the martyr's prayer, that is Tyndale's prayer, had an answer. A king's eyes were somewhat opened, and a royal order cleared the way for the English people to have what Tyndale planned for them. Unwittingly. King James may have done more than he wished when he approved Bancroft's rules of translation. Now, at the time of the making of the King James, significant advances had been made in linguistic studies. Benson Bobrick writes, the first Hebrew grammar had appeared in 1503, the first Hebrew lexicon in 1506. Part of the Old Testament or Hebrew Scriptures had been printed in 1477, and the entire text with vowel signs and accents at Soncino, Italy in February 1488. A fully annotated edition, on which all subsequent Hebrew Bibles would be based, was prepared by Jacob ben Chaim and published in 1525. Before long, royal professorships in Hebrew would be founded at Oxford and Cambridge, and comparable positions at the universities of Paris, Wittenberg, and Louvain. Bobrick goes on to point out that many trilingual colleges appeared during this time. The most famous was the one that was founded by Cardinal Jimenez, which produced the Complutensian Polyglot. Say that 3 times fast. The Complutensian Polyglot. Now, what was it? On each page of the Old Testament portion, the Vulgate Latin was flanked by the Hebrew on the left and the Greek Septuagint on the right. Like Christ, the editors remarked, crucified between 2 thieves. You'll get that about 12 o'clock tonight. Regardless of the obvious prejudices that lingered, at least 150 Hebrew grammars were now available. A growing awareness of Semitic language was also present. Yet, the translators were hampered by the lack of ancient texts that were available to them. The Hebrew, and particularly the Greek texts that they were working from, were not the most accurate even by the standards of their own time. Theodore Beza, Calvin's successor as the head of the church in Geneva, had prepared an edition of the New Testament 40 years prior based on a more ancient and less corrupt manuscript. The English scholars were still a little adrift on tenses in Hebrew, while Koine Greek, in which the New Testament is written, so unlike the Greek of Plato and Aristotle, still held mysteries for them. And only later translations would correct their mistakes. To be specific, the Greek New Testament the translators used were based on manuscripts that dated no earlier than the 10th century. Biblical scholarship has advanced greatly in the years since the King James was produced. Many older manuscripts have since come to light. Of these, Codex Sinaiticus is the most famous, discovered by Tischendorf in 1844, dating back to the 4th century. Codex Alexandrinus, dating back to the 5th century, was presented to King Charles I in 1627, but it was not available to be used by the King James translators. Put simply, the Greek text that is used today, known as the Alexandrine text, is preferred to that used by the King James translators, the Byzantine text. But this by no means should undermine the general reliability of the King James. The issue concerns minor textual variations. Not a single teaching of the Christian faith is affected by these variations, nor is any major historical aspect of the gospel narratives or early Christianity affected. Now, as we mentioned earlier, Upon James's succession to the throne, the Puritans wanted to have a more favorable hearing. On his way to England, James was presented with the Millenary Petition, signed by 1,000 Puritans, spelling out their grievances in 1603. Following his coronation, James realized he had to take action to maintain some sense of harmony. In October of that year, James issued a proclamation under pressure from the bishops. This was done to discuss the differing views of the rival parties. Bobrick suggests something else. The king gathered himself together and prepared to demonstrate his fitness to be the head of the English church. And indeed, he maintained a firm control over the whole meeting. Of those invited, only 4 Puritans were represented, and they were moderates, handpicked by James himself. The overwhelming majority was comprised of the king's privy council and a great number of bishops and deans, though it seemed to many on the first day that James would side firmly with the Puritans, having roundly criticized the corruptions of the English church. The second day's events dispelled that. James denied all the requests of the Puritans except one, that of producing a new translation. Nicholson suggests the underlying motive on James's part, a desire for wholeness and consensus, for inclusion and breadth, for a kind of majestic grace, lit by the clarity of a probing intelligence, rich with the love of dependable substance, for a reality that went beyond show, that was not duplicitous, that stood outside all the corruption and rot that glimmered around him. These were the elements in James and in the Jacobean court culture that came to shape the Bible that has its name. That brings us now to the preface of the King James. Miles Smith, the Bishop of Gloucester, wrote the long preface to the version, also called the Translations to the Reader. Smith thoroughly reviewed and justified the working methods the revisers had adopted. He defended the project with numerous quotations from Clement of Alexandria, Jerome, Cicero, Augustine, Chrysostom, Sophocles, Horace, Plutarch, Josephus, and Virgil, among others. Smith also paid tribute to those translators who had gone before and acknowledged that the King James built on their work. Nicholson says it insists on the virtues and necessity of translation, snipes at the Catholics for the love of obscurity and darkness. Its atmosphere, that is, this preface, is generous and majestic. Smith's wonderful words, easy without pretension, sensuous without affectation, profoundly generous, shaped by a desire to reveal the innermost secrets to all, might stand as a representative for the underlying aim of all the translators. This preface affirms a high view of Scripture and reveals much about the behind-the-scenes process of translation. It's my belief that this preface should be included in every modern translation, if for no other reason than to remind the reader how serious the process is, as well as to honor Scripture itself. For all the seriousness and anger and violence that can be hung around 17th century religion, Bishop Smith, here writing at the very end of the process in which he had been engaged, remains buoyant with enthusiasm and with a quality that can be only called grace. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever seen a page or a section out of the original King James in 1611. There it is. See if you can read that. You probably can read some of it you won't be able to read because it doesn't read like our English. The King James Bible, along with the words of William Shakespeare, is regularly singled out as one of the most foundational influences in the development of the modern English language. It's no accident that both date from the late English Renaissance, when English was coming into its own as a language. Indeed, the King James has had a profound impact upon the way people speak and write. An example of this, examine the speeches and the writings of Abraham Lincoln, and try to imagine a major speech that Lincoln gave, or a major proclamation that he would write if it did not have the King James Bible behind it. I can't imagine it. The House divided speech that he gave before the war between the states. in which he spelled out his position on slavery. I can't imagine that to be written without the King James Version. And so many politicians and so many writers of all different walks of life have relied upon its prose. It flows in places better than any other, I think. But this was not the intent of the translators. One of the greatest paradoxes linked to the King James is that it achieved literary excellence precisely by choosing to avoid it. That's no mean feat. To be specific, the translators' main goal was accuracy. In working toward that, they felt free to avoid, for the most part, wooden or mechanical renderings of words and phrases. To be sure, they did not always succeed. I point you to the phrase, I trow not, T-R-O-W, or evil concupiscence. You know what evil concupiscence means? Evil desire. Well, why didn't they just say evil desire? Because concupiscence was the word they chose. And many other phrases I could point to that are awkward and have a completely different meaning, such as, those of us who are alive and remain shall in no wise prevent them which are asleep. When you prevent someone, you're, in our way of thinking, you're preventing them. No, that's not the word. The word there is precede. We will not precede those who are asleep. That is, we won't go before them. They will go before us. Big difference. But the word prevent in the 17th century means something different from what it does in the 21st century. Those kind of differences make a difference when we're trying to understand the version of the Bible. But the consensus of judgment in the 19th and early 20th centuries was that the King James Version had made a massive contribution to the English language. The achievement of prosaic and poetic elegance that resulted was, so to speak, a most happy accident of history. In commenting about the style of the King James, Nicholson says that it has plumbed and searched for the essence of the meaning, and in that way is an exercise in passionate exactness. He further says, it is a sleight of hand, but this is the central paradox of the translation. The richness of the word somehow represents a substance that goes beyond mere words, and that is its triumph. McGrath points out that the decision of the translators to emphasize accuracy allowed them to achieve a wider lexical range than would otherwise have been possible. This hampered them in some instances in being accurate in obvious passages, but it allowed for a greater richness of the text and a more mechanical approach to the issue might have engendered. Such passages as Job 36:33, Mark 7:3 and 4, and 2 Corinthians 6:11 through 13 stand as examples of a lack of elegance in the King James, but those are a few rare exceptions. More generally, the King James Bible achieves a degree of elegance that has been the envy of its successors. You only have to think of such passages as Psalms 23. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. And on that psalm goes. I have not found yet a translation of the Bible that matches that beauty of language. Or Matthew 11:28 through 30, come unto me all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That flows. And that's one of the great achievements of the translators. The richness and the beauty of the English language. The King James has a profound impact on the way people speak and write, even today. Bobrick says, in the end, the King James Version was such a book that if everything else in our language should perish, it would alone suffice to show the whole extent of its beauty and power. Its subsequent impact on English and American literature might be traced in 1,000 ways. In the work of religious writers like Milton and Bunyan, or the more secular brethren like D.H. Lawrence, Walt Whitman, and Defoe. Without the King James Version, it has been said, there would be no Paradise Lost, no Pilgrim's Progress, no Gettysburg Address. Whitman's preface to Leaves of Grass proclaimed a New Testament creed. And in such poems as Song of the Answerer, biblical cadences are used to make manifest the signs by which the poet Messiah will make himself known. John Bunyan's whole schooling was the Bible, the King James Bible. His Pilgrim's Progress and Grace Abounding are pure biblical prose. And when you think of the great speeches of modern politicians in the United States, such as John F. Kennedy's inaugural address, Martin Luther King's series of speeches leading up to his killing, one realizes they are inheritors of the language of the King James Version. Lincoln's speeches, going all the way back to the House Divided speech, would not have been possible without the King James Version. It has richly enhanced the English language. That is not to say, however, that the King James Version is flawless. On the contrary, as in any translation, there are mistakes and there are errors. Compounding this is the amount of archaic language that remains in the edition of the King James that is in circulation today. And by the way, next Wednesday night, we're going to discuss which edition of the King James Version we have today. It's obviously not the 1611 edition. You'd be surprised to know what year our edition of the King James Version came out. At any rate, Wegener says the language had become antiquated. Those who had read this Bible most of their lives were used to its oddities and archaic wording. But those new to it had a difficult time. McGrath points out that in adopting forms of speech that were already becoming archaic, the King James Bible had the unintended effect of perpetuating ways of speaking that, strictly speaking, were already dying out in everyday English speech. Consider, for example, the use of the word thou and its related forms instead of the word you. Much evidence exists to suggest that the use of thou and its forms at the time of the King James Version were seen as an insult to one who is lower in social standing. But the reason the King James retained those words is a bit simpler to know. McGrath stresses that the King James translators could not depart to any significant degree from the bishop's Bible. And since the bishop's Bible is directly linked to William Tyndale's translation, it should not come as a surprise that much of the King James Version has incorporated Tyndale's work. So McGrath concludes, the King James translators simply did not believe they had the authority to make changes reflecting developments in the English language. And so they continued to reproduce the English of nearly 3 generations prior. Such an explanation also applies to the retention of the ending ETH on verb forms, such as saith instead of says. In William Tyndale's time, many years before, they were in general use. By 1611, they were virtually obsolete, and yet the translators retained that. In spite of the archaic forms, the King James eventually achieved supremacy above all other translations. That did not happen overnight. Indeed, the immediate reception was, as McGrath puts it, polite disinterest. Yet Wegener says, in time, criticisms died out, and the King James Version became so dominant that for many it was the Bible. Taken as a whole, the King James Version has had a positive impact on society, especially in our country. The prose of the King James Version had the power to move and convert, and it certainly transformed discourse of all kinds. Quite obviously, there are translations that are based on better Greek texts. There are translations that are more literal. The American Standard Version 1901 comes to mind, as well as the English Revised Version prior to it of 1881. But none of them quite compares in breadth, beauty, and majesty to the King James Version. In commenting on how the King James renders Psalms chapter 77, Nicholson summarizes what many think of it. He says the King James is communicating itself in a way which is quite unaffected, neither literary nor academic, not historical nor reconstructionist, but transmitting a nearly incredible immediacy from one end of human civilization to another. That, he says, is the everlasting miracle of the book. So I hope that gives you a flavor of what happened to produce the King James Version. Next week, I'm going to dig a bit deeper. And we're going to be looking at a few passages, and we're also going to be looking at some interesting editions of the King James Bible. There are some that will curl your hair in the way that they were known at the time. There are many editions of it that came out, and in fact there was one called the He and She Bible, because it mistranslated a word. One mistranslated as he, one other mistranslated as she. And there are many other interesting editions that we're going to talk about. So we'll do that next Wednesday night.